Great, thanks, Aaron. So the paper title is fairly self-explanatory, so I'm just gonna go spend the next 15 minutes deconstructing the title. So first, let's start with learning computer programming. So there's been a lot of excitement lately in the news and the media about computing for all and a lot of these initiatives about teaching everybody how to code. So here's some really awesome examples from some of my colleagues. So this is Scratch Junior. This is a tablet-based visual programming environment for teaching young children how to code. This is code.org, which organizes the Hour of Code in the United States, which is every year they're trying to get into classrooms 1 hour of learning some kind of programming. This is the Alice environment from CMU and other universities that is a graphical virtual world for teaching programming via storytelling. And Looking Glass, which is from my colleague Caitlin Keller, now at WashU St. Louis, is another one of these virtual worlds for doing storytelling and programming. So there's a lot of these really exciting initiatives going on with teaching and learning programming, both in terms of social initiatives and also tools and toolkits. One thing that you might start noticing that these have in common is that these are mostly targeting younger children and younger adults. So these are mostly K-12 and college students are the ones that are the primary targets for a lot of these Learn to Code initiatives. So I was really curious about this because what about the other side, right, of the life spectrum? So by 2030, some estimates are that a quarter of the North American and European population will be over 60 years old, and about a sixth worldwide. So this is a significant portion of the population who are 60 and over, and people are, with improved healthcare, people are living longer and longer lives. So there's been extensive HCI research on older adults consuming technology, and also increasingly on being producers of digital content. So studies of blogging, of forum posting, of music and photo sharing and everything. But so far, people haven't explored how older adults are learning to produce new technologies via coding and computer programming. So I was really curious about this question of, first of all, how many people are actually doing this? And if so, how are they going through this process? What challenges are they facing? So this study is the first known study of older adults learning computer programming. So this is a fairly wide open space at this point. And the goal of this first initial study is really to discover both their motivations and their frustrations. So this is a fairly high-level study. And the way I went about this is with a simple 10-question survey. So the more salient points in the survey are their employment status. So are they currently working? Are they semi-retired? Are they fully retired? And what's their current or former occupation? Then, why are you currently learning computer programming? So what's your motivation? What resources are you using to learn? And also, what has been the most frustrating thing so far about the learning process? So with this survey design in mind, then comes the question of how do we find these people, right? So where are we going to find older adults learning computer programming? Because in the majority settings for learning programming, as I noticed earlier, are K-12 schools and colleges. So how can we find these older adults doing it? So fortunately, for the past few years, I've been maintaining a fairly popular online platform called the Python Tutor. You can go to pythontutor.com for it's a visualization site for helping people learn computer programming. And people have used this in conjunction with MOOCs, with Khan Academy, with coding tutorials. And it's a way of writing code and visualizing what your code is doing to really help you build mental models and debug. A really nice byproduct of this project is the fact that there is a worldwide usage. So this is a visualization showing density of number of users approximately by country. So North America is really predominant, and India is the kind of heaviest users, and then it kind of spreads out throughout. So it's currently being used, kind of the lifetime kind of totals in the low millions of users in 180 plus countries. We would love to get more in Central Africa, but there's a lot of technology challenges with getting in those areas. But the interesting thing here, this is what motivated me really to look into the study and this instrument, is that 1/6 of the users are actually 55 or older. So we have a very high level age survey on there, and we found that 1/6 of the users are 55 or older. So that means that there's actually quite a few people to survey. So what I did was I just deployed the survey to the site for about a year and a half and just left it on the site. So the site is a free open source site people can go to learn, and there's just a small link on the bottom saying, support our research if you're interested and you're over, you're 60 or over, just click this link to fill out this short survey. So in that time, we got around 500 respondents. The mean age is around 66 years. Median is about the same. Here's a very high-level graph of, this is a histogram showing per year. So on the x-axis is going from 60 to 85. So 85 was, I think we had 1 or 2 people at 85. And they're color-coded by whether they're retired, semi-retired, or working. So those are the 3 choices. And unsurprisingly, it dips down. The number of working dips down with age, right? So that's to be expected. And this was all self-reported. We filtered out some noise for, clearly people just spamming the site. But we looked at all the responses and stuff, and we have, the kind of thoughtfulness they put into the free response questions, we have reason to believe these age reports are fairly accurate. So the respondents cover 52 countries, unsurprisingly, again, based on the demographics of it. This is an English website. The demographics is mostly North America and Europe. The most common occupations that were reported were scientists and engineers. So again, this is not super surprising that the folks who are taking the initiative to learn online are probably kind of STEM sorts of majors, very technically minded. Another 18% were K-12 and college teachers, which is interesting. So most of these were not computer science teachers. These were math teachers or science teachers or folks who have kind of a background in teaching, and now that they're retired, semi-retired, they're interested in learning this kind of new programming thing because it seems interesting, and they're perhaps interested in also maybe teaching it on a part-time basis. And then another 12% were software developers, actually, which was an interesting finding. So these were usually older software developers that came of age with technology, say, in the 70s and 80s, and now they actually want to learn kind of new languages and frameworks to kind of update their toolbox. And another 8% were actually business executives and managers. These are people who are not programmers by profession, but they've always been curious about coding. And I'll give you a quote in 1 second about that. So just breaking down 3 sections of the motivations, frustrations, and then conclude design opportunities. The most common age-related motivations that were the most salient were 22% wanted to learn to make up for missed opportunities during youth. So I'll show a quote about that. And a lot of these sentiments were, I always was interested in code and technology and stuff, but I don't really have time to do it until now I'm retired and I have all this free time. I'm really curious to learn. 19% were for keeping their brains challenged, fresh, and sharp. So this is kind of a mind-strengthening sort of exercise. And 5% were actually directly motivated by younger relatives. They had kids or grandkids who might have been learning in school, and they were like, oh, I'm retired and I have some time. I want to learn what my children and grandchildren are learning. So here's one quote from a 67-year-old retired chief information officer. So he said, I did a little programming in school but then when I started working, however, I got, quote unquote, kicked upstairs into a management role quite quickly and was never able to program professionally. I always wanted to be able to create programs, but between work and family never took the time. Now that I'm retired, I'm trying to fulfill the dream and learn. And a second quote, which I really liked, is, first, by endlessly learning new things, I hope to delay or reduce the effects of senility in my brain. So this is the brain strengthening theme. And then, second, to take advantage of this data produced by the many health-related and sensor-based monitors, I want to help myself and other senior citizens maintain an independent living lifestyle that is affordable by the masses. So this is someone who is clearly an engineer of some sort in their career, and now that they're retired, they want to try to tinker and play with kind of health data and maybe make these devices to help help their peers live a better life. So let's go on the flip side, the frustrations. So there are a bunch of frustrations that the learners reported that are very much in common with anybody learning programming, like syntax errors and installation, and all those stuff are not as salient in terms of age. But the 3 most common age factors were perceived cognitive impairment. So these are all self-reported. I'll give you a quote on that in 1 second. The second one was actually a bit surprising because, lack of free time is something that, you would usually associate with people who are still working. But for a lot of these older adults, they said that their lives were already full of stuff. They were either caretakers for their partners or they had other structural activities. And even finding the time to do this was a challenge for them, especially because for those of you who've been programming for a while, doing computer programming is something that's very time consuming and all encompassing. So finding the amount of time is hard. And 10% said a lack of human contact with tutors or peers. So this is because this is an online setting, people are learning from MOOCs and other online resources. But I think this is actually sort of age-related as well, because usually older adults get fewer opportunities to be in, say, a formal school setting or a coding boot camp or a company where they can be with like-minded colleagues, especially if you're retired. So thinking about building technical communities of older adults is an interesting design challenge. So a quote-related frustration, 71-year-old retired IT person said, given that I was a very early adopter of microprocessor and microcontroller technology, I have no fear of the equipment or the concepts. But things that were automatic a few years back seem to take a lot more time and effort to digest and store than they used to. Early onset Alzheimer's? Probably not. ACS, advanced curmudgeon syndrome, probably some of that. This person actually wrote a series of very humorous and self-deprecating responses that I really liked. So to conclude in the last few minutes, let's think about design opportunity, right, for this population doing this really interesting and complex activity. And the theoretical framework I want to frame this with is what's called learner-centered design. And this has been, so Mark Guzdow at Georgia Tech, who's a big proponent of CS education, he actually wrote, I can give you the links later, he actually wrote a book called Learner-Centered Design for Computing Education. And the high-level idea of this is that to think about how do you apply all these classic techniques of user-centered design to learners. Right, so the crux of the learner-centered design philosophy is to use the learner's own motivations and frustrations, to study those first, which is what I've done with this first study, is to use those motivations and frustrations as the basis for pedagogical, curricular, and tool design, instead of folk intuition. So a lot of tendencies for folks who are designing educational tools is that instructors themselves have some folk intuitions about what they think students in a certain audience want. But in fact, the learner-centered design methodology is why don't we study the learners first, see their motivations and frustrations, and use those as the basis. So some kind of high-level ideas about learner-centered design for older adult programmers. One is targeting, right? So you want to have something where they say, hey, this looks like it's for me, right? This sort of curriculum or tool or website, you want it to feel like it's for them, for that target audience. And this is, again, useful for any audience. So brain training games were mentioned by multiple participants. So these are things like Lumosity and other sorts of these sites that are popular with older adults who want to keep their brains sharp and active. And several participants actually made analogies to that. They're like, oh, coding and puzzles are kind of like these brain training games. So maybe thinking about crafting pedagogy in that way is interesting. Another one is that they didn't want to be patronized, right? So they don't want to use these things that are perceived as kids' toys, right? So some of these awesome environments that may be good for young children may not be good transferring directly, because they're like, oh, this thing is for kids, it's not really for me. So again, just think about targeting the audience. Second one is contextualization, so thinking about contextualizing projects and curricula based on the kind of needs and preferences of this audience. So one thing that many participants mentioned was curating digital media. So this has been studied in other works of older adults and media creation. Is they want to make photo scrapbooks or make kind of blogs or things that aggregate their experiences with family. Personal storytelling, again, using maybe code or websites as a medium for telling stories about their own lives and experiences. And also the healthcare front, which one of the engineers mentioned, of being able to organize their healthcare data and to kind of be personally empowered to kind of monitor their own health. Another design opportunity is around this idea of universal design, right? Which is the idea that thinking about designing tools and environments for one motive by one audience can actually help everybody, right? So there are examples like if you have gradated curbs, which is for people, say, with motor impairments, that actually helps everybody because if you're pulling your luggage up the curb, it's nice to have a nice gradation. So it's one of these designs that helps everybody. So one of the things to think about here is what about program environments that can help mitigate some of the negative effects of both cognitive and motor impairments. So these could be either things to help out with writing code or remembering things about their code and such. And these things, even if they might be inspired by an older adult population, I think these could help all novices because cognitive load is a huge problem in novices learning. So to conclude, one of the takeaway questions and points that I want to kind of propose with this work is this fact that tech is, the technology world is notoriously youth-centered. If you think about popular images of what being a programmer means, or even all these educational initiatives about programming, every kind of picture you see if you go on Google image search for computer programming or coding is probably someone under 30, right? There's either kids or college students or young people in their 20s around, kind of gathering around spaces and such. So, and simultaneously, there's been this great movement, what's called computing for all, right? So there's been this great movement in computing education to try to make computing more all-inclusive and including groups that have traditionally been underrepresented. And I think there's a lot of really great work on this, and I would love to extend this definition of computing for all to really mean for all ages. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you for your talk. I was just curious to know if you came across anyone with lower than 12 years of education, and if that made a difference with respect to their motivations or frustrations, or if they even interested with learning computer programming.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's about whether we encountered server responses with lower educational levels that were pre-college. We asked that, and you could look in the paper for details. We didn't break that down too much in the analysis, but one thing with this survey was that the audience was probably a better educated audience, at least college level. There were people with kind of technician sort of degrees, so they didn't get four-year college degree, they got these kind of two-year technician degrees, but they were still fairly technical, right? They were kind of IT people or electricians, so they still, this is still not a random sample of the general 60+ population at all, because these are very, very early adopters, but we didn't go into that in detail. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Robin Brewer, Northwestern University. Great work. I had a question kind of off this second point, computing for all should mean for all ages, and you mentioned that the age of your participants was a bit younger, older adults. So do you have any insights as to how the motivations were different for older adults older than, say, 72, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question about the age stratification. So I would say older than, say, 70s, they were probably all retired, and they were learning for the kind of brain training and enrichment. The folks who are the younger, older adults, a lot of the people who are in their 60s were still working. So quite a few of them were actually learning as professional training. They're like, I know how to do COBOL, and now I need to do Python and web development. So a lot of the younger people in our audience were actually, for professional training purposes, they were learning.
Hi, I'm Varsha from University of Colorado. Great talk. I was just wondering if prior knowledge in programming was a factor in their motivation. You talked about how some people program maybe in the 70s or 80s. Was that a factor in them being motivated to learn it again, or do you look at people who had no prior knowledge in programming or computer science?
That's a good question about prior knowledge. I think the audience was both. I mean, there were people who were programmers or electrical engineers, and there were people in the audience who were like doctors and accountants, and they had no prior programming experience. So I think these results reflect people with many levels of prior experience. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Andrew Potter, University of North Alabama, age 66. And I wanted to make a suggestion, actually, because I returned to programming after a gap of over 20 years recently. And a lot has changed, but the most striking thing was the resources online, excuse me, things like Stack Overflow, that I find programming now is kind of a social networking experience, in that instead of a solitary, sitting there debugging your code late into the night, you're online, looking up things, interacting with other people. And I think that is a resource that's available to us that could be used even more effectively than it is now.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that. And this actually, one of the challenges that some of the folks brought up was exactly what you mentioned, was that 20 years ago when they were programming, things were more self-contained. You had a manual, your API was 10 functions, you could see it all, and now they have to go look for all those resources and plug in different libraries together. So thinking about communities is really interesting as well, because perhaps they're not as comfortable participating in those communities because they haven't done it before. So
Asking a question in some of those forums can be kind of dangerous.
exactly, it can be intimidating. It's a great point. Thanks.
Awesome. Philip, thank you for a great talk and congratulations